This PowerPoint is to walk you through the timeline assignment, explain what's expected of you, how you'll be marked, when it's due, etc. Okay, so your timeline assignment is 30% of your total mark. There is a draft of it due on October 23rd, and then the final timeline will be due on December 4th. You have to hand in a draft. If I haven't reviewed a draft of your timeline, I will not mark your final timeline. So you must hand in a draft by October 23rd. So for this assignment, you will create a timeline documenting 40 key events in the history of immigration and work in Canada as we have covered them in this class. So you will need to pick out 40 to 50, I suggest 50, important dates in the history of immigration and work in Canada from 1600 until 2000 and chart them in the correct chronological order on their timeline. So when I say correct chronological order, that means that if it's 1630, it goes before an entry that is for 1640, okay? So in this week's module, you began preparing for the timeline assignment when you filled in the Fields of Endless Day video activity sheet. So this activity gave you a chance to chart some of the important dates, some of the important people and groups, as well as the events, laws, and policies that made up Canada's Black history. So it was kind of like a little practice run. So your timeline will be made up of timeline items. Each item will indicate an important date in the history of immigration and work in Canada, as we have covered that history in class, in the readings, in the assignments, and the videos throughout the term, right? So each date and entry is a timeline item. You have to have 40 items minimum, and you can have a maximum of 50. I suggest using 50 because I will just mark all of them. And if you use 50, you have room to have gotten 10 wrong, right? So I strongly suggest you use 50. For each date that you choose, you have to clearly record the date on the timeline and then which event, which policy or major change in Canadian history took place then. And you'll need to give me specific details. So you need to tell me who, what, why, where, right? The when is the date. For each date, you also have to explain the relevance of that event or that item to the history of immigration, work, and racism in Canada, all right? So any timeline items that are about topics that we have not covered in class, in the readings or the assignments or the videos, will not receive marks. So you want to find all of your timeline items in the course materials. Every timeline item is worth 3/4 of a mark, okay? So 1/4 of the mark is for a clear date listed in chronological order. So if you put 1640 before 1630, you will not get that quarter mark, okay? The next quarter mark is for indicating which event or which law or which policy or major change in Canadian history has happened on that date. And you need to include specific details to get that quarter mark. All right, so that's where you want to be answering the questions. And then the last quarter mark is for ensuring that your item is relevant to the history of work and immigration and racism in Canada, and if necessary, explaining why it's relevant to the history of immigration, work, and racism in Canada. All right. And like I said, you need at least 40 items. I strongly recommend you use 50 just to give you a bit of a buffer. So I've done a sample timeline item. You can see it also on the timeline assignment sheet. So what I did was I talked about voting history. So here you see my timeline item. So first you've got the date, okay, 1867. Under the British North American Act, that's the law, that formed Canada, deciding who could vote was left to the provinces. But all the provinces agreed that only men who were British subjects 21 years of age or older and who owned property were able to vote, okay? So First Nations men, Indigenous men who met these criteria could vote if they were willing to give up their native status and their treaty rights, right? This meant that the majority of workers in and immigrants to the country had no vote or political influence. It also meant that Indigenous folks who wanted to vote had to own land individually, and most Native people own land collectively, had to give up their status as Indigenous, meaning that their children wouldn't have Native status either, and give up all rights to any treaty settlements. So very few Indigenous people did. So this left the vote and electoral politics generally almost entirely in the hands of white, wealthy British men. Okay, so that last sentence is my explanation. So the elements in this timeline item are a nice clear date, 1867. The timeline item explains what law, policy, or events happened on that date. So this one, it's a law. All right, so what was it? It was the BNA Act, the British North America Act. It was the law re the formation of Canada and voting. Who was impacted? White men with property could vote. All right, Indigenous folks with status, immigrants, and women couldn't vote. Right? Where did this apply? Across all the provinces, so all of Canada. And why? Well, why did this law end up being this way? Well, because the law was written by adult, white, usually British male landowners, right? And how did this work? It worked by denying workers, Indigenous folks, new immigrants, and women any votes. So the political dominance of landowning white men was guaranteed in the formation of Canada, right? So that last one, how, kind of does the last point. It explains how it's relevant to the history of work and immigration in Canada, because it kind of explains why so many racist laws were passed. If only white guys with land are allowed to vote, you're going to get a very particular set of laws. Okay? So coverage, that's the other element here, right? Your timeline has to cover particular periods. So in the 1600s, you have to have at least 3 events. You can have more than that, but you have to have at least 3. In the 1700s, you have to have at least 7 items, right? You can have more than that if you want, but you have to have at least 7. In the 1800s, you need 15 items, right? And in the 1900s, you need 15 items. Okay, so we covered the 1600s and the 1700s already in our first couple weeks of reading, so week 2 and week 3. So you might want to start looking there for 3 items that you can use from the 1600s and 7 items that you can use from the 1700s. We talked about the 1700s a bit this module too. So your timeline is going to look like this. If you look at the timeline assignment sheet, it is also a template, and I have posted a separate timeline template in Blackboard. So you will use this template to make your timeline. Okay, so each of your items will go in one of these little square boxes. You will start each item with a nice clear date. I've made just a silly little timeline here to give you an example of how timelines work just for the last year. So your timeline, some of your items might have a specific month and day, but lots of your items will probably just be a year. Okay, so your timeline needs to start in the 1600s and it will end in 2000. There are no marks for any items before 1600 or items after 2000, right? And make sure that you use the correct template, all right? And on the template that I posted in Blackboard, I also have some instructions on how to make new boxes, okay? It's pretty self-evident, and if you have trouble, let me know. So when is it due? So your draft timeline has to have at least 20 items, and I would strongly suggest that you make sure you have your items for the 1600s, your 3 items for the 1600s, and your at least 7 items for the 1700s on that timeline, and it will come to me on Friday, October 23rd, midnight at the latest. Right? I'll accept early submissions of that. If you want me to look at it before intersession so that you can work on it over intersession, feel free to send it to me early and I'll get it back to you as early as I can. Okay? I will return the draft timelines with some comments after intersession. Okay, so this is my way of helping make sure that everyone can ace this. Okay, my review is to help you. So the final timelines will be due on Friday, December 4th, and they have to have, like I said, 40 to 50 items. To submit the assignment, you'll be using Blackboard, right? So you'll click the assignments link on the right-hand menu, that blue menu in Blackboard, and you'll click on the timeline assignment, and then you'll upload your assignment. if you're confused by this, you go follow this link and it explains it. So the next little bit is just about how to do a good timeline, how to get a really good mark on this, okay? So the do's and don'ts for your timelines. So these are the do's. For each item, the date, the names of people, the titles of the laws, and the descriptions of the events must be accurate and spelled correctly to receive marks, okay? So points that lack in specific details will not receive marks. Don't be vague, right? Be sure to name laws and policies and explain what those laws do, all right? So don't just tell me the name of something, tell me what it did, okay? So don't just tell me there was a Chinese Immigration Act. Tell me what the Chinese Immigration Act did, okay? Be sure to mention which group folks were part of, because often it's a big part of what makes them historically important. Right? So this module, if you did the readings and watched the video, you heard about William Hubbard. And he was just another municipal politician, unless you know that he was the first Black man to hold such positions in Toronto. Be precise. Okay, so make sure you've got it right and that you're not overgeneralizing or exaggerating. So don't say that Lord Simcoe outlawed slavery, right? Lord Simcoe, this was in the Isiju reading. It's also mentioned in the Rain Doe reading, the Ontario's Black Pioneers reading. He actually passed a law that stopped the sale and purchase of slaves in Upper Canada. He stopped the import and export. He didn't outlaw slavery. Okay, so make sure you're accurate. Be sure to list who did what to whom. So beware of passive voice, right? Don't just say that the last Beothuk in Newfoundland died, right? Tell me who the Beothuk were and exactly how they happened to die, because it wasn't random, okay? Make sure you tell me the whole story. So don't just say that Marie-Joseph Angelique burned down a bunch of Montreal, okay? That's not a timeline item. You need to explain what happened that caused that fire, all right? And why that fire was set, and then what happened to Miss Angelique after that, okay? So make sure that you only list items that directly pertain to immigration, ethnic relations or racism, ethnicity, and work in Canada, or that provide context for one of those things. So for example, in the Isiju reading, he talks about how the American Revolutionary War is context for the immigration of the Loyalists, okay? If you're not sure of the connection to the history of immigration, right, make sure you explain it. Okay, so if you're going to use the American Revolutionary War, you need to explain that it's relevant to this because it caused the Loyalists to come to Canada. Okay, if you're going to use World War I as a timeline item, explain what this has to do with immigration, right? Racism, ethnic relations, and work in Canada. Okay. Now, here are the don'ts. All right. So don't give more than one example of a phenomena, all right? So there are a few examples in your reading of ethnocide in the Americas, all right? Don't give me all of them, all right? Give me one example of colonial ethnocide, okay? So don't repeat yourself, okay? Don't have multiple entries that tell the same story. Don't use vague dates, all right? You will not get a mark if you say in the 1800s, thousands of Chinese worked on the railway. Chinese Canadians worked on the railway. Okay, that's incorrect. You need a specific date, a specific event, a specific law, or specific numbers, right? And there are specific numbers in the Avery reading when we get there, or the Chinese Canadian Steel reading. There are specific dates that groups of Chinese workers were brought to Canada, and there are specific numbers about the groups of workers. So don't neglect the details. So for example, we're going to talk about the Chinese head tax in a couple of weeks. And the Chinese head tax started out at one point, and then a few years later it was made higher, and a few years later it was made higher. Make sure you get all those stages, okay? And finally, in the don'ts, there are 8 periods in that Isiju article. These are not timeline items. Do not list them as timeline items. Also, don't wait until October 22nd to start working on this. I strongly recommend you start this week, Okay, there are lots of timeline items in the readings from the past few classes, as well as from the video in this module. Don't use external sources, okay? Everything that you need to ace this assignment is in the course materials, and I will not give you marks for things that we have not gone over in this class, okay? So don't copy from the readings or videos, and don't work on this with other folks. All the timeline items have to be in your own words, okay? Don't neglect to submit a draft of the timeline by October 23rd, right? If I haven't reviewed your draft, I will not mark your final timeline, okay? So this review of the timelines over intersession, it's for you guys. It's to help you get a good mark, all right? So please make sure you submit a draft timeline by October 23rd so I can give it a look-see and so that I will mark your final timeline. If you have questions about this assignment or concerns, post them in the question and answers discussion board. You probably are not the only one with that question, and it'll be good for everybody to see the answer. I've started a thread in the discussion board just for this assignment, and you can also always email me. Okay, so good luck with this assignment. Get started today, and I look forward to seeing the drafts during intersession.